Good afternoon. My name is Murat Sönmez, a member of the Managing Board of the World Economic Forum. A warm welcome to all of you, and to all of you who are watching this webcast session on Powering Africa. Powering Africa is part of our ongoing efforts as the World Economic Forum on energy, electricity, oil, and gas. And the insights that we generate from this session will be carried into the work and will be published on our online platform, Toplink and Transformation Maps. Electricity, which is the topic of today's session, is vital. It's a lifeline for economies. And when there's power, there's development. And at the World Economic Forum, we focus on increased access to energy, improving its affordability and security, and actively pursuing environmental sustainability. And trade-offs have to be made, but they're all essential ingredients. Without further ado, I'll hand the session over to Trevor, who will be guiding us through this session. Trevor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. We're still waiting for two speakers to join us. But in the interim, we will get the show going. Essentially, the idea is that we have a conversation around the middle where we are, and we involve everybody else. Let me start first of all by introducing to my right Innocent Lutiro, who is a partner and head of South Africa Financial Services practice at Bain and Company. And then move on to my left, Linda Mabena Olugunju, who is Managing Director at DLO Energy Resources in South Africa. And lastly, but certainly not least, Babs Omotoa, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer at LNG in Nigeria. The way we want to frame it, I think, let's see how the conversation is going to evolve, is to say this is a crisis that's a huge opportunity for the African continent. How do we turn the crisis into an opportunity? There's over 600 million Africans at the moment who are without electricity. That's a huge challenge. They don't have means of cooking with clean energy and that kind of stuff. Another very frightening statistic is that the entire sub-Saharan Africa uses electricity far less than that is used by Spain. That's shocking, isn't it? And that at current trends is going to take us, I think, until 2080 for the majority of Africans to have access to power. And another negative is that the absence of power, the blockages, the shortages, results in about 2 to 4% GDP slowdown. That's how much it costs us. That Africa needs $55 billion a year from now until 2030 for us to be able to catch up. But the good thing is that not all that money needs to come from outside the continent. So we're going to be looking at what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what are the financing, what is it that cannot be done. Let me start, if I may, with you, Innocent, to sort of give us a rundown of what it looks like, of what the key challenges are, what the opportunities are in about 2 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Trevor. Good afternoon, everyone. As Trevor mentioned, I'm from Bain and Company in a financial services practice, but I have a history in the power industry. My first ever job was as a power station engineer. So I've spent time in nuclear, coal-fired, and hydroelectric plants. So I know a little bit about the industry. Africa, as Trevor said, needs sufficient, sustainable, and affordable power to fuel its development. Growth and job creation is heavily dependent on us being able to power our economies. Our desire and quest to industrialize cannot happen if we don't have sufficient power. And socioeconomic benefits like improved living conditions will flow from that. So this is really a critical cornerstone and enabler of all the conversations that we're having about developing the continent, moving us to a different and a new paradigm in terms of economic development. Trevor mentioned the statistic which African Development Bank has put out there that says if we address our power problems, we will have an extra 2% on our growth, on our GDP growth. That's quite key. And there are key considerations for each country. Remember, this is historically been a country competence. So for each country, the key considerations, which are the quantity of supply that you need as a country for your own economic aspirations, the security of supply. Are you going to be relying on a supply source that you control and you're confident in its security? Also, the energy mix over time, which the issue of climate change and emissions has brought to the fore. If you look at, if you use South Africa as a proxy, 94% of our energy is from coal, and with probably another 4% or 5% from nuclear. Renewables are growing, but still minuscule. And that is a function of the kind of primary energy sources that we have in this part of the world. In the SADC area, coal is the primary source of our primary energy. There's a bit of hydro, but not that much. And traditional sources, the key thing that we also need to understand is that electricity supply falls into two categories. There's the base load, which basically is defined as the load that powers the minimum load that is required by a country. And then there's the peaking load. Traditionally, coal and hydro and nuclear have been because of the efficiency that comes from it, the scale, et cetera, have provided base loads. So one needs to have that at the back of your mind when you look at solutions and how you want to solve the challenges that we have. And there are a number of factors that are detracting from sustainable solutions. And I think I'll pause here and we will continue the discussion.
Can I invite you to, in the first instance, just introductory remarks, and then we get into the meat. How do you perceive issues, particularly within your area, community-based solutions, as far as power is concerned, the supply side and the demand side?
Okay, my name is Linda, and I'm IPP developer in the renewables space, so my bias is obviously towards renewables. As was mentioned, I think the power issue varies across the continent, country to country. I think South Africa recently has done very well in its IPP program, in particular with renewables. As was mentioned, you do need a diversity of supply, a mixture of your base load and peaking, and a mixture of technologies as well. However, the advantage of renewables, I would say, is the quick construction time and how quickly you can get renewables onto the grid, and the fact that they are clean energy. So to give an example, since the inception of the Renewable Energy IPP program, Eskom has connected 36 projects, which has amounted to 2,030 megawatts of electricity being put on the grid in under 3 years. So it doesn't solve our base load issues, as was mentioned. However, it goes a long way in reducing demand and meeting some of the energy needs. What I think is required across the continent really is regulatory framework that is clear for investors to put money in, whether it be coal, nuclear, oil, gas to power, etc. What took so long for the South African program to take off was the clarity in the legal regulatory framework. And why we haven't had a large-scale IPP program similar to the South African model across the continent is, again, that lack of clarity and also a commitment from government to underwrite these power purchase agreements so that investors feel comfortable putting their money into these projects.
What's the state of play as far as regulatory situations concerned all across the continent, not just in South Africa? Okay. Are we in a happy place?
It varies from country to country.
Right.
So an example, I've done some projects in Namibia, and one of the issues we had getting projects off the ground there was because the Bank of Namibia wouldn't underwrite power purchase agreements. And also there wasn't an overall renewable IPP or an IPP program. So you almost need that drive from government to say we want to do a large-scale program. So you do have projects popping up in different countries. So, for example, I know in Ghana there's a large-scale solar plant that's meant to have gone up 200-odd megawatts. But again, there's nothing at a national level. So what's required if you're going to address these issues is a national policy on energy similar to what has been done in South Africa, if that can be replicated. That's one point.
Just a quick one on the, what are the concerns as far as the governments are concerned in terms of the legal framework to buy back the power and that kind of stuff?
Well, the issue is always a risk. Where does the risk lie?
Yeah.
How do you allocate risk? That's what we always fight over when we're negotiating PPAs. And you need to allocate risk, and risk needs to sit where, with the party who can handle it. The South African PPA is not 100% perfect. Right. However, it's the closest thing we've had, and it is bankable. The banks were supported. And I think what's important is governments involving the private sector when they are drafting this policy. So what they did right here is that National Treasury involved the major banks, involved investors, and we got that PPA relatively correct, and it's always changing. I mean, the things that are changing to the program, it's not stagnant. And now that program for renewables is being replicated for the coal program and for the gas utilization master plan that's going to come out as well.
Fantastic. At this juncture, let me welcome and introduce Mr. Ngubane, who is the interim chairman of ExCom. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And also to welcome Elizabeth Littlefield. Thank you. We're delighted to have you on board with us. Omato, you are in the gas sector. What are the constraints? What are the opportunities? Do you see this being a solution for the continent?
Thank you very much, Trevor. When I look at the situation of power in Africa, which I think you described as a crisis, what always comes to my mind is when I remember the thousands of Africans who have been found in recent times to be moving on boats from North Africa to Europe, Italy, and hundreds, if not thousands, dying in those endeavors. And when you look at it, while some of those may have been from political or security challenges, I think a lot of it is economic driven. And the power situation in Africa, just 68 gigabytes in sub-Saharan Africa, I think is a huge contributor to the level of poverty and desperation you see in Africa. So I think it's indeed a huge crisis, which I think requires, in my view, an emergency action by leaders in Africa. Coming specifically to the solutions, of course, a diversity of options. Gas, I think, has remained one of the biggest part of the equation, like all other hydrocarbons, coal and oil. But gas has the advantage of being the cleanest hydrocarbon. It's also cheaper, more available, and has been a big solution. What we've seen in Africa in the last few years is quite a huge variations in developments that have occurred. In the conventional space of gas, we've seen new countries like Mozambique and Tanzania, who never featured on the gas equation, become the biggest gas reserve countries in Africa. And what that tells you is that we just haven't even explored enough in Africa, especially on the east and west coast of Africa, huge gas opportunities that we haven't touched. And when you think about the unconventionals, I think South Africa has been one of the biggest areas of opportunity in Cairo, Mauritius, Nigeria, opportunities in gas. So I think when you think of gas, Africa really has not explored the potential that I think we have quite a lot of.
Why have we not pursued the potential?
It's a combination of factors. I think in many of the countries in Africa, of course, oil and gas is quite heavy in terms of investments and technology. Requires very good fiscal and regulatory framework. It requires infrastructures to be in place. And when you think about a number of African, in fact, Mozambique and Tanzania are only just about developing their first set of real regulations around this area. Nigeria, another country with oil and gas, just about maturing the level of regulation fiscal. So I think regulation, infrastructures have been key issues. Of course, financing, because these are hugely expensive projects to run. But finally, just to add that apart from even what we know today, there are new technologies also emerging. A few years ago, most people didn't know about shale gas, which today has changed the whole world. But we also know that there are new technologies coming through called methane hydrates, which Japan has started to already pilot, which can even have 5 times more what we see in shale and conventional gas. So huge opportunities, and I think projection is that by 2040, close to half of the power solutions for Africa will still have to come from base loads like gas, and I think that's where we need to pay attention to.
Okay, Mr. Ngubane, you've been in the news, ESCOM, in terms of power supply and the constraints, and how long are we going to be in this space, of load shedding? How long will it take us to get out of this and plan properly so that we don't have the kind of negative effect that load shedding is having on the economy, on job creation and things of that nature?
Well, it's a very complex area. It means sufficient money. It means sufficient technical skills being available all the time. We have a number of old power stations reaching the end of life. Most of them will have to be retrofitted with flue gas desulfurization to meet the current emission standards. But of course, it's been 20 years since South Africa built a new power station. So it's a fairly complex area. But I can probably ask you whether we've experienced any load shedding since you arrived in the country. And the answer will be no, because we are dealing with the issues. We are minimizing load shedding through the use of the 800 megawatts being brought in by the 60 unit at Medupi. Next year, we are hoping to finish the Ingula, pump storage, which would give us probably about 3,000 megawatts. ESCOM has been fixing and maintaining some of their units. They have now come back online, and this is why we have not seen load shedding. And as
we're grateful for that.
Yeah, as we move along this trajectory, we hope to make load shedding just a nightmare, a thing of the past. We have a very clear governance structure coming into ESCOM, contracting with all the management, right from the CE, right down to the manager at the power station. Liquidity has got to be maintained by every cost center. Governance has to be very clear in terms of performance contracting and evaluation, and which is operational excellence and financial management in terms of liquidity. So the stage is being set for effective governance. So I am hoping that my wish that by the end of this year, we see the end of load shedding will come true. And from the way the steps we are taking, we are getting there. Our CEO goes with his senior executives to power stations every Friday. That is now a standing routine to check, to track, to monitor, and to report back to the board.
Fantastic. In terms of your toolbox, nuclear is featuring. What other options do you have?
Okay.
And also the next phase of the build-up of infrastructure, what does that look like? So your toolbox and then the build-up of infrastructure moving forward.
Well, the two major infrastructure projects we have, or three rather, it's Ingula, pump storage, the two coal-fired power stations, Kusile and Medupi. Those are the new build. The allocation of licenses for the independent power producers lies with the Department of Energy. But they've also been very proactive in calling for bids. We are now in the fourth window of bidding for solar, wind. The minister has called in a request for information from industry in terms of gas use. In other words, we'll first convert some of the power stations we have into gas, but we'll also build new gas electricity generation in the country. So that's going to be a very big project. The results are still going to come in so we can see what shape it's going to take. Nuclear will only be about 9,500 megawatts. So it's not as big as people tend to project in the newspapers. It's just part of the mix.
Right.
We're moving more towards renewables because in the long run, renewables will be cheaper than coal. And so, but of course, in all this, we need leadership from the regulator. The regulator decides what pass-through monies come through us. and that's what determines the pace and the rate of development. But of course, I must add that we are part of the Grand Inga negotiations. 2,500 megawatts will pass from Grand Inga to South Africa. We are talking with Zimbabwe and Zambia about how we'll share that pass-through from Inga with them. So the Southern African power pool is also going to be very intimately involved as far as Inga development is concerned. And this will be just the first take on the Inga project. Obviously, it's going to grow much, much bigger.
Fantastic. I'd want to set some point to get to how we look at the regional cooperation to make energy a thing of the past. Elizabeth, allow me to move over to you and welcome.
Thank you.
Clearly, one of the problems that keeps coming up, apart from the regulatory framework, apart from the pricing issue, is the appetite for investing in these huge projects. Before you came in, I was talking about Africa needing 55 billion a year until 2030 to close the gap. That's a huge gap. What's the view within the investor community as far as investing in infrastructure and all the issues related to making that investment pay within a reasonable time?
Oh, thank you very much for that question, but maybe I could start by just saying what my organization has been doing in the power sector, and then I maybe can come to the challenges, and I'd love to talk about the regional cooperation as well. So for those of you that are not familiar, I work at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is the U.S. government's development finance institution. And our job is to help stimulate private capital flows into sustainable economic development in emerging markets. And we do that by providing long-term financing, loans, as well as political risk insurance and other things that mitigate the risks and provide stimulus for that capital to flow. Actually, we've made Africa a priority for ourselves, and we're very proud to say that as evidence of the kind of investor demand that you mentioned, that we've seen our portfolio in Africa grow from about 6, 7, 8% of our $10 billion portfolio to a full quarter, and by the end of this year, it should be a third of our portfolio, which I think is indicative of how much investor demand we see, because, of course, our long-term loans are accompanying some private investors' capital. So it's been a priority for us, and we're really proud to have seen how big it's become. On the renewable energy front as well, we've made renewable resources a priority since I joined the agency in 2010. It's grown tenfold, renewable energy across the globe. So now we're doing a little over $1 billion a year in financing of renewables. And on the continent here, that ranges from everything from geothermal, where we've funded the Olkaria project in Kenya, doubling its capacity, to wind, where we're working not only in Kenya on some of the very large wind projects there, but also in West Africa, where we're working on some wind projects there. Solar, I was just yesterday at Boshoff visiting the Sun Edison facility near Kimberley, but also off-grid. We're doing quite a lot in off-grid as well as mini-grid solar, because we know that's the way much of the rural population is going to get its power. And then I should mention gas, because you mentioned it earlier. A good portion of our portfolio is now in the gas sector, and we're proud to be participating in the Azora IPP in Nigeria, and looking at a number of other natural gas deals across the continent, because we too agree that baseload power is going to be necessary. That being said, what gets me excited is when you look at Africa really being in a lead position in terms of renewable energy build-out throughout the world, maybe coming from a low base. But in 2014, Africa added more renewable energy than in the previous 14 years, which is a rate that no other continent can claim. So we're excited about that. With respect to the challenges, though, I see a few that investors bring to us and that we see in trying to execute these transactions throughout the continent. First, there was an interesting survey that was done recently about what investors see as the #1 hindrance. And actually, regulatory frameworks was the lowest of their concerns. But the highest concern cited by investors in these surveys was political will, execution capability, and a sense of urgency on the part of the ministries. And we see that as well. And so actually Power Africa, I think, is addressing this in some small part. But we definitely see this as a problem as well. Now, it's true that there's some countries that have a bad recollection of some unfair transactions that were poorly structured that left a bad taste in their mouth. But we do see that execution capability as being a #1 hindrance. The second capability of the hindrance, of course, as much of as we've discussed often, is the creditworthiness of the off-takers. You know, it's interesting, just 10 or so years ago, you all would know better than I, you know, 2/3 of the power being financed on the continent was for export. And that made it much easier to finance, whereas now it's 2/3 for domestic consumption, and that makes it more complicated because you're relying on the creditworthiness of the off-taker. And I think you mentioned earlier, you know, how do you share risk between the off-taker and the developer and the financier, and that's been a challenge.
Talk to me about the political will. I mean, why would that be a problem when, you know, it looks like this is a crisis and the politician would want this issue to be resolved?
I think what we're seeing is that ministries don't often have a deep enough bench within the ministry to undertake a complex new structured financing transaction. That's what we've seen in country after country. And, you know, President Obama's announced the Power Africa initiative just a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now. And one of the dimensions of that, which has been very, very useful, has been the coordination of transaction-specific technical inputs at the ministry level and the transaction advisors housed in ministries throughout the continent that we've seen, at least, have had a material effect on speeding along the process of transactions, as well as bringing financial resources to bear to provide, for example, international legal counsel to governments throughout the continent.
Fantastic.
But can I mention just the third
Sure.
challenge? I mentioned execution capability. I mentioned the creditworthiness of the off-taker. The third one, frankly, is the persistence of fossil fuel subsidies, something I think we don't talk about enough. But that market, the market distortions. Sorry, is that me?
It's
No.
Mr.
So-
Ngubane.
Sorry. I do think that the persistence of fossil fuel subsidies creates such market poor signaling for the market that it's actually a real hindrance to the development of renewable energy across the continent. So I fervently hope that with fossil fuel prices being where they are today, it's a great opportunity to move ahead with addressing the persistence of fossil fuel subsidies.
Fantastic. At this particular moment, I would want to ask to entertain a couple of questions from people in the room. If anybody has a question or a contribution right now, this would be the right moment to do that. Yes, introduce yourself and then briefly ask your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Kalle Stedtwein, the Minister of Finance of Namibia.
Oh, okay.
Okay, if I'm allowed 2 or 3 comments and then one question.
Sure. Shall we make them 2? And a question and a comment so that we give everybody an opportunity. A question and a comment.
Okay, can I ask the question at the end because it flows better with my...
It's all right, Minister.
Well, first of all, I think what was quite correctly mentioned is the question of how we can make financing of these very necessary infrastructure projects feasible. And I think there was some reflection of what was the hindrance, and it was called political will. Now, let me share with you what our problem in Namibia was when we tried to negotiate power purchase agreements. The financiers insisted on a guarantee of price, not production cost. They insisted on no taxes at all and a complete policy freeze. And that was the basic framework that the government was confronted with, to say, if you don't give that, if you don't guarantee that, we cannot finance, the risks is too high. We consulted with the World Bank and we found that that is not according to international best practices. That is too greedy, if I may say so. Because if you have a sovereign guarantee, which Namibia has, you don't need to guarantee this. The guarantee for cost, production cost, is a reasonable one. So there must be a toning down of ambition on the side of the financiers if we want to have these agreements clinched. There is no lack on political will on the side of the necessity to have them and the necessity to have a good mix of sources of energy. So those are the comments. My question is, we are talking about costs of infrastructure, we are talking about the necessity to have electricity, and we benchmark everything against that cost. What we feel is left out of the equation is the tariff policy and the affordability of that power. If I see what happens in South Africa and Namibia, we have got extremely steep increases in tariffs. We have that in spite of a very skew economy where the majority is relatively poor. And we do that while we are trying to industrialize and be competitive with our finished goods that we so produce, of which power is an important input. Now the question is tariff not an important consideration? Shouldn't we do focus on that as well?
Tariffs.
Tariffs.
Okay.
Cost of, and then lastly, our model is we produce power through utilities, like Eskom, like NamPower, and we have not yet managed, in my opinion, enough to leverage private sector appetite to venture into the sector.
Okay. Right.
Wouldn't that be a possibility that we should?
Right. Panelists, note those questions. Any other question? Can I please ask, if you're going to ask, if you be brief, no questions? All right, shall we deal with that? Who's going to respond? You feel? Yes?
I'd like to respond.
Sure.
I'll go through your 3 points that you raised. The change in law, the issue there for investors is when there's a change of law that will affect the returns of a project adversely, it makes it difficult to invest in that project because you're loaning money to finance these projects, first of all. The other issue there was some of the loans were being done in dollar denomination, and I think there was an issue with the currency risk as well. The second point in terms of your tariffs, if you look at the South African model in terms of renewables, what we did right here was the competitive bidding. We didn't do a traditional feed-in tariff. So if you look at the SAWIA, which is the South African Wind Association study today, wind power has come in 40% cheaper than new coal build. So renewables are bringing tariffs down. It's cheaper electricity that we're putting on the grid. And I think it's a model that can be followed. Thirdly, I think your point was about utilities. Again, it goes back to encouraging investment. People want to come into Namibia. We definitely want to play at the rest of the continent. I think if we just start having a generally not greedy, just a stable sort of environment for investors, there's really no need why we wouldn't come in. So yeah, I'd definitely like to chat to you afterwards.
Yes, please.
If I may just add one small comment, and I apologize for having my back to you, but that's the nature of the beast in this room, I think. Sorry. I would fully agree with what you said. We're seeing in just one set of solar investments, the price of the power having dropped in the last 2 years from 30 cents now down to 7 cents. And that's clearly competitive with most of the baseload, yet thermal power that's being produced. But with respect to the power purchase agreements, we too found that a lot of time was being lost between the governments and the developers and the financiers negotiating and losing time on basic terms. So we developed actually with our fellow development finance institutions and U.S. government agencies a consensus document on one piece of paper that has the 10 elements of a bankable power purchase agreement. So we thought that would be helpful guidance, and less is more. So just 10 pieces of paper, 10 elements on one piece of paper that just talk about the basic elements that most financial institutions, development institutions, or banks are going to want to see in a power purchase agreement to be able to finance it. If anybody would like a copy of that one-page document, you are welcome to send me an email at elittlefield@opic.gov, and I'm happy to send you over that piece of paper.
Interesting. Minister, I want to get back to you. Sorry to put you on the spot. This particular transaction that you're looking at it, what time frame do you have? Do you have time frame on your side, or it's going to drag along for as long as possible? I think, for me, that raises the issue of the political will, the agency, in terms of ensuring that you get rid of whatever blockages that you have and you implement the project.
You're right. There's a sense of urgency because we are in a squeeze. We are in a similar situation like the rest of us in the SADC power pool. There is a deficit in the short term. In the longer term, that will stable out, and we will have enough generation power to satisfy our needs. So the political will to reach self-sufficiency in the total pool is there. The question is, and mind you, you are talking to the Minister of Finance,
yes, sir.
Is that urgency will be satisfied, but not at any cost. And I think I'm very happy to hear that there are best practices, and by the way, it is that sheet that we used together with the World Bank to negotiate with these power purchase agreement partners.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, I know you have issues that you want to comment on, but before you get on there, I want to ask you about the importance of regional cooperation. Because one would have thought that clearly with these huge deficits and the realization that we need to come together, these numbers are huge. What's stopping us from actually deepening regional cooperation as far as power generation and supply is concerned?
I think the issue of regional cooperation is very important because the location of primary energy sources and demand is not always in the same place. So Mozambique has got huge gas reserves. They don't necessarily have the demand that matches or justifies the construction of large power stations. That demand would probably be in the Southern African power pool or beyond. So, and in deciding where you locate your power station, there are a number of factors that you take into account. You either locate it closest to the primary energy source, and then you transport power through the wires. There's obviously losses in the grid, etc. Or you locate it closer to the demand. That from a country perspective, I spoke about national security, where you want to have that within your borders. So for you to be confident that you will have a plant in Mozambique that you depend on, and there is historical precedence to this, Cabora Bassa, etc., when Mozambique was unstable politically, supplying South Africa had implications. So that collaboration and stability within the region is important for regional cooperation. Added to that, there's a need for standardization so that everyone is able to feed into a similar grid with particular standards and an efficient functioning market that enables payment and also how you control the grid, because it's very important from a technical perspective to control the stability of the grid. Sadly, and Linda mentioned to me that from a solar perspective, there's a storage technology that's coming through, but sadly, when you generate power, typically you can't store it. And you need to be able to hive it off to somewhere else, and you need to manage a stable grid. And my experience within the Southern Africa power pool from its early inception in my power generation days was really designed to do that and to control it between the different countries. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of regional cooperation.
Fantastic. Mr. Ngubane, I'm going to come to you in terms of the issue that has been raised by the minister, which we're dealing with within South Africa, which is price, not at any cost, he says. The quandary of, not building plants, at the end of the day, you have expensive power, and not having power because you have not planned properly, or you haven't priced the power properly, and at the end of the day, you actually don't have power. It's a very difficult situation to sit on. Are you comfortable with the pricing place where you're sitting it right now?
Well, we brought in huge smelters, iron ore, steel industries, aluminium smelters, because we are the cheapest price for electricity for a very long time. That was our comparative advantage as a country. But quite clearly, with our plants aging, we cannot keep up that rate of excellence. We have spoken about an increase in the tariff to make it a cost-reflective tariff, but we know that it's politically not really doable. So we have engaged in what we call a business productivity program, and we have saved 70 billion rand in the past 6 months. So with efficiencies, you can actually probably delay the rise in tariffs and so on. It's a matter of being able to control wastage, and technology can do that. Digital technology can do that. We, in fact, will be cooperating with the WEF on this type of information and access to such technologies. So there's a lot that can be done to put back the inflation in the energy sector. But ultimately, of course, we have to build new power stations.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell me, sorry, you want to come in, yeah? Sure.
I could just, I think on this issue of tariffs and high costs, what I find sometimes is that we usually don't look at total life cycle implications, always very focused usually on the front end. And I'll give you just two issues as examples. For example, in Nigeria, the vast majority of people then who don't get access to the electricity then go into private generation, where they spend 5 to 6 times more to generate their own electricity. Whereas if you had been willing to pay higher tariffs, you will get the electricity much, much cheaper. And I think when you look downstream in the implications of what power can bring to a country, to people, in terms of jobs, industries, and all of that, frankly, a lot of time being wasted on the front end in terms of trying to get down to the last dollar, I think is not as valuable. So that's one thing I would say on that. But secondly, on the regional cooperation question...
So do you think that the politicians are overplaying the price-sensitive issue?
It sounds to me like they don't recognize the crisis, because if the crisis is well recognized, I think it's not the time to try to be looking for, will the investor make money or not make too much money? We spend so much time on, is it making 50%, 60%? That's the least of the problem, because people are going to pay 5, 6 times more if you don't solve that problem. You're missing out on industries, you're missing out on jobs, you're missing out on so many things in the equation. And so I think, it's back to the political will question again, so very focused on what I think is not where the bigger issues really, really are. I was also going to comment on the regional cooperation with the example in West Africa, of course, where there's the West African gas project between Nigeria, Ghana, Togo, and Benin. I'm not sure if anyone is from Ghana, Togo, and Benin, but it hasn't worked well. Because while the pipeline has been built, I think it goes back to the question that, the comment I think Innocent made earlier. Ghana, Togo, Benin relying on Nigeria. What you find most times is Nigeria will first sort out its own problems before they will meet those commitments, and which means that in the last few years, only half of what has been committed has been met. And this is one of the big challenges I think we have in regional cooperation, is that the primary suppliers will need to, again, have the political will to honor their commitments, irrespective of, the implication. Because if you don't do that, then regional cooperation in itself will stand very little chance of working.
Mr. Governor, let me bring you back again into the issue of regional cooperation. You spoke about the Southern Africa power pool. What is it that we require to get to a point where the Southern African power pool works to, efficiently meet the expectations of the region?
Well, I've said using centers of excellence like ESCOM for the region, bringing in young people to our training centers will greatly facilitate the development of electricity, production in our neighboring countries, because we have the expertise. The expertise is can be extended given enough participation, for instance, by DFIs. That's one thing. But also, of course, being part of the program of integration within SADC, so far we have concentrated more on trade than on energy. Lifting this up to a new level will facilitate this. And as I mentioned, Grand Inga offers a new opportunity. Mamabulo would have done the same thing in Botswana if it had progressed. I'm hoping that we can progress that, because then it will add a huge amount of energy for the region.
Tell me about Inga. We've been talking about it now since before I was born. Where are we with that? Are you hopeful that during our lifetime this thing is going to happen?
Well, I was talking to Mr. Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister. He's very much involved in that project with the WEF. Very keen to go. And I think it's going to be realizable not just in our lifetime, but very soon.
Okay, that's good to hear. At this moment, I would love to entertain questions from around the room. Yes, there's a hand at the back there. Again, introduce yourself and be as succinct as possible, please. Thank you.
My name is Wadi Ahimi. I work with a company, Sahara Group in Nigeria. I hear a lot of the things you say in terms of power generation. But what I don't seem to hear is what exactly are we looking at in terms of the full value chain? Because we continue to generate power, and the people who are really going to pay for this power at the end of the day are the end users. So I can't hear anything in terms of what investments are we putting into distribution, transmission to ensure that all that we're building in terms of generation, whether you have the gas, you have the thermal power, is actually going to be paid for at the end of the day.
Thank you very much for that question. Linda, you want to deal with that? So you're shaking your hand in agreement?
Yes, and I have to tread carefully because Eskom is on this panel. One of the challenges
You have my protection. You'll be okay.
One of the challenges as a developer we face, like you rightfully said, is you produce power and it's about getting it onto the grid. So because there's been an underdevelopment of the grid infrastructure across Africa, and South Africa is not immune to that. We have all these power generators, and there's an issue sometimes in connecting them. Eskom has done well. However, I think they also do admit, having engaged with the grid access unit, that there is an upgrade that is urgently required in order to facilitate all of the electricity that's going to be produced, one from renewables, coal, and gas. So to give an example, one of the challenges we faced with our project is you get a cost estimate letter at X, so you put in a bid and you come in low in your tariff, etc. Post-bid, we get a budget quote that's 2 times or 3 times that cost because the infrastructure or the grid infrastructure hasn't been accounted for, and there's also a delay in how when we connect, which obviously affects our EPC and pricing, which can't hold longer than that, and our construction. So grid infrastructure is a huge issue across. I know Nigeria faces the same problem. I'm not sure. I know it's billions of dollars that are required for your grid infrastructure. So it's a continental problem that also requires the private sector to play. I don't think we can rest everything on, state-owned entities' the doorstep. I think this is a place where it would be nice to get Eskom collaborating as well with the private sector in assisting with those challenges.
Let me bring you in here, Innocent, because the political will issue keeps coming up. But there does seem to be space for the private sector to come in. In your view, what is required for us to get there, to ensure that the private sector, both at generation and transmission, plays a role that is, at the end of the day, profitable, but also commensurate with the social needs of any society?
So on that subject, I recall the Minister of Finance asked a question as to why we think in terms of utilities, in terms of building out this infrastructure. And to the point of the last questioner, the issue of transmission and distribution is an integral part of the infrastructure we're talking about. It's part of the $55 billion that you spoke about. So that's we're not necessarily ignoring that. If you look at, I'm not saying they're necessarily the best example to follow, and will not follow them, will probably leapfrog some of the developments. The privatization of the electricity industry in Europe, in the UK, in the late 80s, was on the back of massive investment by utilities to build the infrastructure. So the private sector got involved when the infrastructure was already built. If they had come in at the beginning, they might not have invested in some of the infrastructure that is marginal in terms of its return and in terms of its functioning. So if in South Africa, where probably the infrastructure has been invested by the state for a long time and it's in place, you can talk about allowing access to the private sector and building them out. In areas where you do not have the base availability, private sector will come in and will invest in areas where they have a good return. And a lot of those are not necessarily delivering the development that's required. It's a bit of an ideological statement, but that's the reality. So it has to be, the solution has to be maybe a collaboration, a public-private partnership, where the state's objectives are also taken into account in the design and construction of some of these projects.
Okay, fantastic. You want to come in there?
Just one quick comment on the question that was asked. I think we must not forget about the opportunities for distributed power across the continent. Yes, for strengthening the grid, but frankly, off-grid, distributed power, mini-grids have now become an investable asset. They've now, in many cases, proven their commercial viability. And so I think they can shift from the donor-funded focus that they've had in the past to being genuine, commercial prospects, and ones that are going to be critical to reaching some rural populations throughout the continent. So I think any conversation that addresses that question and the social good question that you're talking about needs to take into consideration everything from solar home systems all the way up to mini grids.
Well, what's you still understand, the minister's view about greedy investors?
Sorry, what was the question?
Greedy investors?
Yes, I've met some.
You've met some. and you want to come in somewhere?
Well, I was going to say, let us take steps in a normal milestone development you see in a child.
Right.
At the moment, let's focus on the independent power producers and the renewables, because that's where the biggest contribution is going to come from. We have got vast kilometers and miles of infrastructure in terms of transmission in South Africa. A lot of it needs to be renewed. So essentially built into that is market failure. To expect the private sector to come and fund that, I don't think it's going to be winnable.
Okay. There's a hand in the back there. Thank you, Mr. Ngwane, for that. Yes, ma'am?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I am Lourdes Fernandes from Angola. And my question is really related with this PPP. So we have here the Overseas Private Investment Corporation from United States. And I believe that if the government is having problems, even if the government wants to have the responsibility to do the infrastructure, as Mr. Dutry emphasized, I think has opportunity for the private, because the point is we have to resolve this problem. It's a long time that we are really tired to hear Inga and all other projects and nothing is working. So I would like to put the specific question to the OPIC, what the private sector, I know African investors that are willing to do investment on powering energy. What should they do? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Elizabeth, you want to come in?
As I indicated before, everything that OPIC and our sister development agencies, development finance institutions do, every single thing we do is with the private sector. So the $1.5 billion or $1.2 billion of renewable energy financing in Africa last year is all being done with the private sector. So, and I couldn't agree with you more. This is a challenge that we need to bring public and private together. But I think we've crossed that bridge, and there's a lot of investor demand. And I think it's a matter of creating the right welcome mat and the right enabling environment and bringing those two together. The capital is definitely there. and growing. But if you think about it right now, only 1% of United States foreign direct investment comes to Africa, 1%. So, that needs to double and triple, but it can only be done so if Africa continues the tremendous positive work it's done on creating a friendly investment climate here.
Well, Elizabeth, what's your pipeline like, without betraying any confidentialities? What's your pipeline like, and where do you see the demand coming from within the continent in terms of regions?
So right now, our pipeline is for probably another $1.5 billion for 2015. Increasingly, we're doing a lot more in gas than we used to be doing. I keep looking at you when I mention the word gas, but it's pretty evenly spread across geothermal, solar, wind, probably a little bit more in wind than before, and the gas sector. We're doing more in West Africa than we were before, although U.S. investor interest in West Africa has been slower for both linguistic and historical reasons. But yeah, so it's a very healthy pipeline. And I have to say, again, I mentioned President Obama's Power Africa initiative, which it involved a $7 billion commitment of U.S. government agencies to finance power across the continent and doubling access, if we could. I think we will easily achieve the commitments that were made because it actually has stimulated new investor interest. We've seen, as a result of the high profile of this Power Africa announcements, we've seen developers coming to the table that weren't even thinking about Africa, a year or so ago, and they're now looking at investments across the continent. So I think the investor demand is there and coming. It just needs to be structured in a way that works
Fantastic.
to the best.
I'm going to call for the last round of questions from the floor. Anybody with a question? Minister, you have a question? If you could make it brief. Somebody's looking at me with a red eye at the end there. Time is running out, so quickly, please.
Yeah, sure. I just want to go back to the question of whether there should be private sector involvement in power generation and how we should structure that. And I just want to come back to the panelists who said it's possibly not possible because of the low returns that conventional power generation has shown it has. My take is that technology has changed. And with that technological change, the landscape and the possibilities of private sector involvement is not anymore quite comparable to the 90s when the European utilities were privatized or outsourced. And I think there are good possibilities where there are PPPs possible and where even individuals can put their little solar plant on the roof and feed into the grid. By the way, with a price increase of 20% year in, year out, that's a good investment. And we should not be blinded by a history that has a different landscape. Rather be innovative and see how we can leverage technology and how we can pool resources from the private and the public sector to bridge the real gap, and that is the power generation or the lack of power.
A quick response from you, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to share with us your final thoughts on this as Innocent.
Minister, I'm clearly aware of the technological developments, but if I go back to my definition of baseload and peaking capacity, we cannot run away from the fact that in outside of South Africa, where there hasn't been sufficient investment in baseload infrastructure, the traditional capacity sources of baseload still remain. If you look at the cost of solar energy and the conversion rate, which are improving, by the way, less than 20 years ago, they were probably 2%. They're sitting at like 15 or 16%. It's very difficult to scale them up into the kind of quantities that are required to power industrialization. Yes, at an individual level, you can self-generate. I do self-generate it at my own house, but there's certain things like driving in the streets and street lights are not working. I expect the utilities to be delivering that, and we cannot run away from that.
Fantastic. Mr. Ngubane, starting with you, your summing thoughts?
Well, in terms of regional cooperation, a lot of work is going on right now within SADC. What we need to do is to extend it into the AU conferences, heads of state conferences. But within the region, we're really moving forward. Renewables, good for peaking, but the state still has a responsibility for baseload.
Fantastic. Taps?
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation is a crisis, as I think was said at the beginning. I don't think both from the political and the business side that has been reflected as such. And I think we clearly need to indeed understand all the opportunities that we have in Africa. I think when you look across, there's just so much opportunity in renewable, in gas, in so much opportunities. And I think we're just letting our people down.
Fantastic. Linda, your last words?
The private sector wants to invest, and also I want to say in terms of regional integration, we'd like to also get involved a lot more. Right now, SAP has been utility to utility. We want to get more IPPs involved in that process as well. I think we have a role to play in solving this crisis.
Okay, Elizabeth, your final thoughts?
Yes, I met someone who runs a mine in northern Malawi that gets his power by trucking 23 trucks a day from Dar es Salaam, 300 kilometers to his mine. The mine is no longer viable as a result of that. So I think when we talk about the price of power, we need to remember that when the alternative is sometimes diesel fuel being flown in on prop planes or trucks, it can be as high as $30 a kilowatt hour. So I think looking ahead, we need to realize that technology costs and everything else have driven prices down so low that we need every possible solution. It's a crisis. We need renewables, we need gas, we need public, we need private, because the alternatives are grave. And if Africa's enormous growth story is really going to be inclusive and lift up the lives of Africans across the continent, we need every possible power source to be brought to bear.
Fantastic. Innocent, your closing remarks?
I think a number of points. Greater cross-country collaboration is important when we match primary energy sources and demand. We need to enable that. We need to standardize the grid and the wires to make sure that there's interconnectivity. Tariff regimes, I know Dr. Ngubane spoke about us being a low-cost producer. I think the tariff must include a reasonable return for the investors, capital expenditure for the future, and operating expenses. And I think it's an argument that at some point we might not have put aside enough for future development. And therefore, the graph that you would follow in terms of increases would be less steep than we're faced with now. A policy framework that would enable IPPs to feed into the grid. And in the short term, and if you're focusing on industrialization, temporary power might be the solution. And there are some companies, without plugging them, like Agreco, et cetera, who've made a virtue out of supplying temporary power. But it must be seen as temporary power. Sadly, some African countries are now looking at temporary power as
permanent power.
Permanent power.
Fantastic. Let me thank the panelists. I must say, though, that what I find, I mean, I'm very optimistic about Africa. I'm optimistic about the continent. I do worry about our power deficit. And listening to all of us talk, I do get the sense sometimes that the agency isn't there. And here is what I worry about. The choices of saying, going back to the minister's comments, power at any cost. Should we not get to a point where power is available and the price of the power is a way of disciplining us to use our resources in a much better and efficient way? Cheap power encourages us to be wasteful. And that is what is currently happening. But I think for me, the bottom line is the sense of agency that I don't see. I travel across the continent. You're right, Dr. Ngubane. Thank you for making sure that power was available in Cape Town. It's such an irritating thing, but one that reminds us all the time that there's something wrong with our continent, but that there are so many opportunities. If only we could have a sense of agency around ensuring that we've got power to create jobs, economies to grow, and I think at the end of the day, to ensure that the political issues that we are scared of don't come and visit us. Because when people have jobs, because there is power, the rise that we're scared of because power is expensive is not going to happen. But anyway, I could go on and on about this thing. I love this continent. If only we could fix the power. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.